And welcome back to the Immigration Ain't Easy podcast. I'm Mo Goldman. My guest today is Mark Shmueli, who is a private immigration law practitioner. He started practicing law, specifically immigration law, I think your whole career, right?
Pretty much. A little bit of high impact civil rights just before.
Since 1998. And he has a diverse immigration practice that primarily focuses on complex family removal, naturalization cases, asylum, humanitarian issues. He's been heavily active with the Federal Bar Association, and in particular, the immigration law section of the Federal Bar Association. In fact, were you previously the chair, or are you currently chair of that section?
I was the COVID chair. I was there for 2 years from October 2019 till October 2021. So
So,
I was
yeah,
the webinar chair.
I was going to say the virtual chair.
Yes.
Um, uh, and he's also been very active in and outspoken against uh, anti-immigrant or restrictionist legislation. He was the representative of the Maryland State Bar Association on the governor's commission to study the impact of immigrants in Maryland. And he co authored its 2012 final report. His practice is based out of Tacoma Park, Maryland, and he's also taught a course at the University of Maryland in College Park, and has been, uh, quoted numerous times in the media on a variety of immigration issues. That I think is most notable was the Muslim ban instituted by the Trump administration, and he has been on numerous podcasts, and I think on interviews on is it on Sirius XM you've been on
Sirius
that?
XM, the Urban View. I was pretty much a regular on that.
That's pretty awesome. So I am really excited to have Mark on with me. Basically, being such a prominent voice for human rights, and so thank you for joining me, Mark.
Well, thank you, and thank you for this show. This is it's important. Your show is important because it not only features what we do and what we see, but you've also interviewed some really interesting folks like the Spanish language Houston Astros broadcaster, which is great because it's this is it. It's all about how we live and where we live together, and I think that's an underlying theme of your show, which I really like the humanizing the
Yeah. Well, let's stop
equity.
hating. Let's stop hating on immigrants, and really look at them from a different perspective, because there's just way too much hate and scapegoating out there, and it's been going on for you know hundreds of years. It's always, I mean, it'll never stop, but the way that we can try to curtail it is by telling the stories of immigrants and why they're here, and the struggles that they face. And that actually leads to my first question to you, which is, why immigration? Why did you get into the field of immigration law, and did any of your own family's history play into that decision to do so?
Um, yes, to part two and to part one. I e- e- even though a great aunt said when I was 3 that he's going to be a lawyer, I kicked and screamed against being a lawyer, and I did not want to do that. But I was so I got a master's in U.S. Latin American history, and I was very involved in college in the anti-apartheid movement. I co-founded Students for Coalition of Against Apartheid and Racism in the University of Florida, which was not at that time was not what it is now, as far as it was very local. type school. So we had active. We were, you could feel not far from segregation. It was different for me. I studied all of those things, and then I went into teaching ESL, and my career in ESL reached a point where I would have need to teach it to learn it more seriously, get an advanced degree, and that would have been my career. So then I decided to go to law school. And when I got out, I went to University of Baltimore, which was, there were two of us that spoke Spanish at that time. The other person was Puerto Rican. It was a very provincial school. There's two law schools in Maryland, and University of Maryland is the one that people know. So I spent law school. No, it's University of Baltimore. No, not University of Maryland at Baltimore. They're right near each other, and it's this underlying. Now it's different, but it. So I was. It was nice because I kind of had this lane to myself. I studied independently. I studied asylum law and did an independent research on that, and when I got out, I was hired actually as a public in the public defender's office to do post conviction relief as a lawyer. But that was right around the time of three strikes, you're out. So I said, gee, there's because three strikes, you're out, and IRA came around the same time, and all these restrictions. So I said, you know what? There's restrictions in criminal law, immigration law. I know it's hard, but just went and did it. And I had wonderful mentors coming out. I think going to law school a little bit older gave me the maturity because to practice, as you know, to practice immigration law, you have to understand different cultures. And when people come out of law school at 25 and they're not out in the world, they don't haven't in that sense, they're just through an academic sphere. There is no apprenticeship, unless there is no place like at a big firm where they can hide you during research for a while and then you litigate slowly with somebody sitting next to you. Most of us either hang our own shingle, or we go to work for somebody, and the reason they hire us out of law school is to send us right into court. And it doesn't matter whether it's you or me with lots of years or somebody new. They have that same case, that same judge, everything's the same. There is no training wheels. And when you don't, and we see these comments, which we would have made at 25 coming, about people from all over the world, and they don't get them, and they think, when it's like, no, these aren't, it's not a, it's a such a cultural difference, and I was more equipped to handle that. So that part of it didn't, scathe me. And also, so that's why. Now for my family, yeah, my family, similar to you, my family was in the Holocaust, and I was really close to my grandmother, who her two older brothers were killed in World War II, and one was in the Russian army, and one was in the Holocaust. And so my dad was actually raised in Palestine, and they were trying to get family out. He was born here. His sister was born there, his younger sister, and they left in 1938. So my grandparents came twice to Ellis Island, and I saw, like, my grandfather wanted to live outside the U.S., and my grandmother wanted to be in Miami Beach, and she stayed there. And I could see the sense of, you can see how these things affect people. You can see the fear, the need for security, the non-adventure, like the things that we see. And when we were both, we're raised with never seeing it happen again. And we live in a country that um, that doesn't value, in so many ways, human rights, doesn't value it overseas, and doesn't value it, and is you know so we're like, so it's a good way to confront it, because there's very few jobs in human rights law. It's a hard thing to do. So this is the good, the bad, and all of it that goes with it. It did gear me towards a natural affinity, because even my dad, who was very conservative in his politics and all of that, I had a client, I remember my first year, and she was an Algerian VAWA client, and she kept calling and calling on the weekend. And my dad was a real, hard, Republican business guy. And I thought I was going to show him I'm being, because my business acumen was questioned, and my determination to make, money. And so he said, I called him up and I said, can you believe this person's calling all weekend? And, and I expected like a Republican answer. He said, something, you're all they have.
Yeah. And that's
So
unfortunately a lot of times You are the person who's their voice who can help that person. And just to clarify two things, you mentioned IRA, which was the Immigration Act from 1996 that went into effect in 97. And at the time you were in law school, we went through a dramatic change in the US immigration laws, where it went from being, a little more liberal to very restrictive. And the law changed drastically. And the second thing I just wanted to point out was the case that you were handling. Um, did you say it was an Albanian VAWA case?
Uh, no, no,
Oh, now I'm blanking what country,
not
but
Armenia.
VAWA was for the violence against
Algerian.
Algerian, yeah. Um, the Violence Against Women Act, which is, we're dealing with some of the most vulnerable populations with those cases, because you're dealing with someone who's a victim of oftentimes pretty horrific domestic violence. Um, Now, let me ask you, your grandmother, what was your grandmother's name? The
Rachel,
one, okay, Rachel.
Rachel.
And your grandfather, were they both Holocaust survivors, or your
No,
grandmother
they were
was,
not. They were not. Her brother was not as.
oh,
My family settled in Palestine in the
Palestine?
1915s. In
Okay.
1915, her father was there. She actually graduated college in Lithuania in Vilnius, and uh, I mean, I have her documented. She graduated. She was graduated to be a veterinarian, and then she moved there and married my grandfather. And then they came to the U.S. They had been around, but they came to the U.S. in the late 20s. My dad was born in 1931, and then um, right after he was born, they went back to Palestine, and my dad was raised there. And then in 1938, she was trying to get her family out, and my dad, being the only citizen in this four-person family, was allowed to come to the U.S. Otherwise, they would not have been allowed. But because they had the one child who was born here, they were allowed back in, and it was, and then it was a very, I mean, I could see the behavior. They were my grandmother was extremely protective, was afraid of losing. I mean, the psychological effects were really apparent to me, and I was really close to her, and she lived to 101, so I had her, all my childhood and everything, and so, and she would show me the pictures of her brothers, entire families, and so, yeah, that
Was
was
Rachel, would you say she was one of the biggest influences on your life? As far as like what shaped who you are?
yeah. I mean, she and my grandfather, my mom's, were, because he was the only other lawyer in my family. He was a VA lawyer. But when I was going through, because I got all his law books, because I'm the only lawyer in the family, so I was going through his documents, and he actually helped somebody with immigration pro bono as a government lawyer in the 50s. And there was his letter saying, thanks for helping me. It was easier back then. You just wrote a letter. And the and he was somebody who, again, conservative person, but you didn't. I mean, just the value of knowing and wanting to talk to anybody, being interested in anybody, I got from him, and so, and my mom too, and he passed it down. And well, I'll talk about why I don't believe that the hate on immigration is a majority hate at all
Mhm.
as we go on a bit, but
Sure. Where was your father born? Was it New
the
York
Bronx.
or?
He was born in the
Okay.
Bronx, which is a
And
county
yeah. Uh,
officially.
and so when they came back the second time around,
Hmm.
did they settle in? Did they eventually settle in Florida? Is that
Well,
where?
they settled back in the Bronx. My dad was, raised in the Bronx, and then he went to University of Miami, and you know uh, he had a good first year of college, and so then so because he was almost failing out, they all moved down there because he's the oldest son, so they moved down to Miami, in 1950 to Miami Beach, and they bought an old apartment building. My grandfather, fixed up a lot of the places. They rented some out, and they lived on Miami Beach half the year. And they lived in, what was then Israel, the other half, because
Mm.
my whole family
Because
was
your
there.
grandfather, yeah.
They were both there. They were
Uh-huh.
they were married there in 1923. But my the family is all over there. And my dad is the only one, and my aunt of all their cousins that stayed here. Um,
What let me ask you, when you went into doing this work, could you ever have envisioned where we are today as far as like, you become an immigration lawyer, you're like, doing your job, and it's I think one of the most intriguing aspects of being a lawyer that does the work we do is that we can have a private practice, and we can have a successful business, and survive and make a decent amount of money doing it, but also it crosses over into um like almost like a nonprofit type of work also, and it's very fulfilling as well, because we are not going after other individuals. The majority of the time we are fighting against the system and the government. And so like going into this in 1998, like could you have ever envisioned that now our area of law is like all over the headlines? It's like the hottest area of law out there, as far as always being in the news, always being talked about. I mean, it kind of boggles the mind, doesn't it?
I mean, it's kind of been that way for a while, but I also know, because the history knew about like the Chinese Exclusion Act. So I kind of, and the turn of this, like for me, it's kind of like our algorithms, right? We think things are big news, and people are like, "You didn't know this big thing happened." And it's like, no, but so and so released an album because it's in our algorithm. For me, my algorithm was always how race, immigration, how much it mattered. But it is what I mean. It's a great question because I was can you can you think I always say it's the most publicized thing, and we don't mean this to be arrogant, because I always tell people, look, I know this stuff, but I'm always learning new things from different angles and different generations, or what's always there. It's hard to keep on top of, but I don't know like what you're doing. And so it's not like I'm trying to correct you, but there's no way you're going to get it, because I don't want you to get it, because you're going to go crazy and you're going to have understand it. So it's something that's out there on the news. I mean, it's like climate change. I know I don't like it, but there's reason that I have friends that work at NASA and Earth and NOAA and these government agencies and study it, that are scientists, because they can explain it to me.
Yeah,
Because we
exactly.
don't know much, but it's a crazy thing, because it is straight up out there all the time. And then the people reporting on it, we see it's such a hard thing to know. And how do you? So it's the most popular thing that's poorly reported on.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, just out of curiosity, do you recall what happened with that Algerian Violence Against Women Act case? Was
Oh no,
it
she got
successful?
her VAWA. It was a very I mean, the Violence Against Women Act is one of those things that is as it should be. Is more lenient. Like it's a weird thing when things can be adversarial that involve harm and trauma, and how just and we see that. And when you talk about opposition lawyers, I mean, you expect in a divorce case for a lawyer to push the envelope and play on emotions and all of that stuff, and manipulate emotions, because they're representing other people's money, and in those kind of contentious cases. But the government's not supposed to do that, but it's a system where they should. And in Violence Against Women Act cases, they actually I actually had, I think it was this case. No, it was another case where the local offices, like your general immigration officer, doesn't look at those, because the people that do have always been had specialized knowledge and trauma and explaining things. So they don't ask for the same documents. Like if you're married to somebody who's abusive, you're not going to be able to have joint banking. I mean, part of the reason is they control the money, so you're not going to have the normal things that might prove that a marriage is a valid marriage for immigration, not a fake ones. So there's leniency on it, which makes, if that area of the law, the immigration service understands for the most part not to press on those. And I had one where they did, where the wrong place adjudicated, and they came with really um, jumped to conclusions in a way that didn't comport with the way that a victim of trauma or abuse would act.
So, and I was going to say the standard is any credible evidence. So that makes it very, I'd say, you know, easy in some cases, depending on who the officer is, to present the evidence because it's more, broad in that arena. But when you take on a case like that, and let's just say it's the first time you've ever done a VAWA application and worked on a case like it, when we look at the anatomy of one of those cases, I don't think a lot of people understand, the difficulty a lot of times to try to, learn a case and try to figure out how do you do, because there's so many different types of applications and so many different regulations and memorandums of law and different policies that go into place depending on who is heading the White House and their administration and their priorities. Did you find it to be challenging at all? And I mean, I'm not going to speak for you, but I can say it was a challenge for me to try and learn a lot of what we do as immigration lawyers.
Absolutely, and it still is. And in fact, I would almost say it's more so now. I because there's because it's and what you were talking about at the beginning is true. And back then, things didn't change as much as they are now, and as even over the last year, I mean, we've seen radical changes to the way that people can apply for asylum, the way that people are treated at the border. So, and an example of that is that I'm a hands-on learner. Like I need to. Um, I need to watch something, happen, which is why I think I've been to border seminars. I've physically been to the border, not only by you and Nogales, but El Paso and Brownsville twice. And I've done these because I had to physically see what happened rather than read it. That's just, the way I learn. And so I think it's, until you do that, it's really hard to see how a system plays out. It was a very strange system from anything I saw in law school and even in a law clinic, where you get one cute case and you can spend all your time on it in a law school clinic if you're doing immigration, and the reality is just so different. So for my first many years, when I would go into immigration court for the master calendar, the first hearing where it was a call up, I would sign. There was a sign-in sheet for a lot of judges, and I would sign in last because I would just watch what
Sit
he's
and
doing.
learn. Yeah.
Sit well, yeah, and just watch because it really is this theater. So these things changing. It's a lot more right now, and I learn it sometimes. Uh, from where somebody's accepting an application or how it's going and whether they close this office. You send it to an office that's closed, it gets sent to another one. I mean, it's crazy. You have a judge, you have a local court, and then the judge shows up on a video from Richmond, Virginia, and it's like, oh, we have a new judge today, but you've prepared for another judge. Um, you
And
know,
you don't know what you're walking into either. Like, who is
yes,
this new person and what's their, take on immigration? Are they going to be, super restriction? Do they
I
come
mean,
from an enforcement
well,
background?
let me ask you a question. Have you ever taken your kids to on a field trip with you to court or immigrate? Well, it would be court.
I did, and I will tell you before you make your statement
No, I
that
want to hear your
the
view.
the funny the only thing my daughter remembered, because I brought all of them at different times. They had a day off, and I was like, "Come check out court." And the funniest thing was, um, the judge came out after the hearing, and we were getting on the elevator with this judge, and and my daughter met him, and he had really big, or he has really big ears, and I asked my daughter later the day, I'm like, what do you remember about court? And she was like, I just remember that judge had huge ears. And that was all she remembered. I was like, really, you don't remember anything else? And she was like, yeah, just the judge had big ears and he was very scary looking. And I'm like, well, the scary part is, that's true, because he's a very intimidating judge. But go ahead.
Well, yeah, no, I was just wondering what their reaction, because I mean, one time, um, uh, you know, one thing that struck one of my sons when he went, and he was younger, but there was a fourth grader. There was a kid like 10. It was a kid's docket, and he just looked at me and goes, "Dad, that kid's like in fourth grade." And he's sitting in front of a judge. It was just, and people don't know that. People hear kids, and that, and also just, and when I went to file something here, and it was all on paper. My younger son, he's like, now he's 19, but it was maybe last year, and he said, "What are you doing? Like, can't you just do it online and get out of here, man?"
Electronically,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I said, so last week I filed something electronically, and you think you're in other courts. It goes into a general place, and then it gets distributed to all of the parties that are part of the case. You get notified by an email something's been filed, but you also need to do so. Before, we used to do like a proof that it was served on them, and so I thought, okay, well, you don't need to do that now, because logically it gets no. You still need to do something like that, because so even when we went electronic, they don't get, it's more like the outside world doesn't, and even other government, I may have a few more friends in the government, because that's what people do around here. And so they from different agencies, and they're shocked, although one of them worked on the computer system, but it's shocking how
Antiquated and
and we don't know.
illogical. Yeah,
Yes. Yeah, yeah. And half of the cases are, you could file them online, and half of you can't. And then I mean, if you tell somebody, well, when you apply for a work permit, can you do it online? Depends
I know.
on what,
It
which
depends on
category.
which category.
And,
Exactly.
and
Like,
how do we learn it? And the thing is, people are like, how do I know that? Like, people get real nervous, and it's like,
yeah,
I don't know how you learn, but you know how it used to be rejected, or we just triple check it. But triple checking things, you don't expect to triple check. And
no,
so that's the thing,
exactly.
is you don't expect to know that that office was closed and everything there gets rerouted to, you could if you knew. And then we know there are people a lot nerdier and detail oriented than we, who know all this stuff and act like it's common. I mean, if you are somebody who has a photographic memory, who is exceptionally organized, who can out nitpick anybody in your world, you will be an amazing immigration lawyer, because the mistakes that we make, you won't
Yeah.
do, right? I mean,
The
because they really do make it impossible in
but
so
you will
many.
also be more prone to losing your mind faster, because even though you are super detail oriented and you cover everything, immigration will find a way to fuck you over and reject an application on the most benign thing.
Yeah, and you won't take it in the ease that you and I will, because it's like, oh
I
yeah,
know.
another thing.
Yeah.
Yes, they rejected it. Yes, they
Well,
refused.
let me ask you about, because the work we do is a grind, and we do have to, like you were saying, contact other people. I mean, there's no way. I don't think you can be an immigration attorney in a vacuum and not rely on your colleagues, especially, and be able to, get even the most basic of information about how you file something at a different court, or different, you always looking for intelligence. um in your practice and history of doing this work, are there specific lawyers that you would say were very influential on you and what you do, and have been super helpful to you?
I mean, I was really. fortunate when I started out that I worked for some amazing experienced nonprofit people at the time, and then I worked for a guy, Michael Maggio, and he was in the time like one of the legends in the field, and he was still practicing, and I worked a little bit for him, and then I worked for one of his spin-offs. you know Somebody from the band who started their own practice and worked for them for a while, and then I started out with a mentor, another who retired long ago, Priscilla Labovitz, and for the first couple of years, and I started out where she would bring in the work, and then I would do she might do the consultation, and then I would do all of the work, but she would be there to supervise. And then, I went on my own. But yeah, no. And back then we had weekly meetings, and it was the nonprofit world. Things were smaller. Now, yeah, I mean, I don't know. And I, for example, doing the children cases, the special immigrant cases, which are custody cases for, um, you know, minors in our state under 21 who've been abandoned or neglected or abused by their parents, and somebody in the can adopt them. I mean, can get custody of them or guardianship, and they can get a green, eventually a green card through that. But I didn't know, I didn't do any of that in law school. I didn't do that most of my career. So my mentor in that is somebody who graduated 10 years ago and is great at doing it. And she taught me and I sat like second chair. And then, the first time I went on my own was a snowstorm and she couldn't get out to the court. So she's like, you can handle it. So I think that so many of these newer attorneys who are growing up in this level of zoo are just it dexterous to it. We didn't have as much. I mean, we had one court. The judges grew older. We had the same five now, except for people that I know who become judges here. Colleagues. All these judges, I've got as much as experience as the person who graduated 2 years ago. So I feel we're a little bit robbed of that, because you know, at least my mentors, probably yours too, had like people the same judge, and they knew them, and you can introduce them, and they're there, and they go to retire. And now um you know it's the expansion of the state. It's become so huge. It's tripled in size. The agency, the enforcement has tripled in size.
Let me ask you about Michael Maggio. Was So he passed away, it must have been about like
Oh
15
wait,
years ago, right?
February '08.
Yeah. And he seemed to have a significant influence on many attorneys, and a lot of lawyers had worked for him over the years. Um, what made him so special?
Well, it's funny because you asked before. I worked actually for him, for an attorney, Allison Brown, who's amazing, very unheralded, very doesn't see her out in public a lot, but she was his number two for a while, and then I worked for her in right out of law school, and as an apprentice, and now she and I work next to each other. Now, we were talking about the other day when I had a hearing, and it was a very not a great case, not the strongest case, but we kept it going for a long time, and I challenged every single thing procedurally, and had long discussions, and objected, on every objection, and explain. And so it dragged on. And right now, they want 2 hour hearings, but I was nice about it, but they weren't, the U.S. attorney and the judge were thrilled, but we kept it going and got what we wanted. But we talked about how, Michael taught us, you fight, you can fight in a courtroom, but don't these are people, and I mean, I'm as politically radical as they come, but people get really surprised because I've got friends that are the person, James McHenry, who was head of EOIR last time. He was a clerk in Baltimore, and as a young law clerk, I set up a pro bono program with him, and he was reluctant to do it, but I kept pushing him and pushing him, and then he went to Atlanta to be an immigration TA, trial attorney, and we know that Atlanta doesn't grant asylum. So I told him, it was like, Yeah, I told him. I picked up the phone one day and I'm like, "Hey, you're shooting fish in a barrel. Like you can come to work drunk and still win all your cases." It's like I had that relationship with him, and then we lost touch, and then he got this job. So I saw him at the AILA conference, and he came over and he like we were chatting like friendly, and people were like, "How do you know him?" It's like, well, we did this together. No way, and because he was really bad on in the job he did, and the same with like I know a couple of these folks, that are with Trump because I would always feel like, and that was something Michael kind of did too, and also like when an ICE attorney, when people would say, well, the ICE attorney, won't, you know, or the objected to something, I would always grant them anything procedurally they wanted, like if they had to continue or something like that. And that's something I learned from him is it's not, I mean, I kind of knew it myself because I was never inclined to be that way, but he brought that to the field. Like it's about what you're doing for people. It's about, and he had a very positive attitude. Like he was a guy who was pretty positive, um, in that sense, that these weren't enemies. They're people with a job.
You know, so you grew up, did your household, was it more of a conservative Jewish household, or what type? I mean, like what sort of household were you brought up in, as far as religion goes?
Conservative.
Conservative. And I I was in kind of the same boat. Going, we went to a conservative temple, and some of the lessons that I took from being in Hebrew school were welcoming the stranger and respecting and valuing equal justice and equality, and different types of good lessons and ethics, and the idea that Jewish people should provide a safe haven for others because we look at our own history and our past and how people have helped us. And you know I think what's troubled me, especially since October 7th, and I think with your connection to Palestine, I'm just interested to hear a little bit of your perspective on this, is how many Jewish people seem to have turned their back against those ideals. I mean, I don't know. I maybe it's always
Oh,
kind of been
oh,
that way,
no,
but
no.
it really makes me sad to think about how scorched earth people have become against the other, or have decided to scapegoat anyone who's Islamic, or from that, who are Palestinians or Gazans.
Or even, you know, Jewish sympathizers. Well, I think,
Exactly.
yeah, I mean, I'm very involved. I'm involved with Jewish Voices for Peace,
Hmm.
and and my older son he went for Black Lives Matter to be involved with Palestinian youth movement, and he said the main reason that he's there is because of our family history, and he's and I mean, I think I think there is always this tension, and I think it's not to just pick on. I mean, it's true. Like I think there's part of it is the special trauma that Jewish Americans have, because I mean, look, the thing is, the West and the United States treated victims of the Holocaust horrifically,
Yes.
and to this day Roma people are treated that way in the world, and to this day, and so I was raised, you're asking how I was raised, not just conservative, but one of the things that I was raised with, which is you can't trust anybody, which is one of the reasons that led to my dad's politics, is you take what you can. I wasn't raised with this like America, this great country. It was like, yeah, he was Republican, but it was more like, yeah, because you know people are out to take stuff, and you can't trust the government, and that lack of faith. I think there's two lessons, things that because American Jews are still the only group that voted Democratic, even because I think there's too much of a leap, even if they don't care about Palestinians, to go to like the authoritarian modes yet. But I think because it's really hard, but I do think that there's a there's also a fear of, nobody cared about us, so we're not going to care about you, and that's a trauma reaction to an extent. And I think, but I think that happens with a lot of immigrants. I mean, Italians used to be socialist, and now, it's if the Italian Americans or Catholics. If you were to say that the Catholic Church dominated the Supreme Court, and there's so many of that, like people converting to Catholicism because it's more extreme and right wing, and we see that, and so I mean, I do think that that's a trend, and it is sad and disturbing, and maybe, and yeah, it
I
is.
mean, I was absolutely appalled when I spoke out against just I mean murder in general, but like murdering young children indiscriminately. I say one thing about it, next thing I know I'm being called a blood traitor, or that I'm a Hamas terrorist sympathizer, and it's a sad state of affairs all around. And I'll acknowledge that, you know, it's one of those two wrongs don't make a right situation. But I think, if you really care about humans and human lives, you can't just, I'd say pick or choose on that. You've got to care about people in general.
Right. And so, yeah, I mean, the way that we were talking, as lawyers, I've said to folks that are otherwise liberal, um, uh, I just read the court transcript, or read there's a case in front of, and then there's just, okay, when there cannot be name calling, like calling you that, it's like, these are facts. And it's the same thing as opposing what the US government does, which, is, you know, in violation of, human rights, or, and it is hard because, and I can tell you, there are people that are in our field who, forgetting people, yeah, I mean, you're talking to some extent, because I remember that post about other immigration lawyers, about people uh who are who have these cases in front of them, and yet have this bias. And so, where is the
Well, there's an ethical
advocacy?
question there. I mean, where are your legal ethics? Like, if you have a bias and you're supposedly going to be representing on a case, to, that it seems like you have a conflict.
I mean, I once had but one of my first cases was a stateless Palestinian case, where we were arguing they weren't citizens of anywhere, because they were from the West Bank, and they were born in Kuwait. They were born in Kuwait, but they weren't citizens of Kuwait, so they were in the West Bank. And Jordan gave them a document of travel, but not a citizenship document. They had to go through Israel for some things, but they didn't have the guaranteed citizenship. For life, so that would be stateless. And I asked Orthodox Jewish guy I went to law school with, would you take that case if it came to you? And he said, I couldn't. I couldn't. And it's like, okay, that's at least honest,
Yeah, at
but
least he's being honest about it.
honest about it. But that's one less person that you have, and that's the thing,
And
is
there's
we,
not a lot of us to do these things too, in the grand scheme of things.
yeah.
And I've had, I took on recently a Palestinian woman's asylum application. And then she had somebody, and then they have some, how it goes. Like,
Mhm.
you do one pro bono, everybody's going to come knocking on your door. And you have to have your limitations, obviously, but you do realize that their options are so limited. There's just not a lot of people with our expertise. And if people are not going to be taking those cases because they have their own internal, bias, um, you know, that's going to whittle down the number of lawyers who can, assist them in a good way. Um,
Right.
so you, being based in the Baltimore area, um, and I just wanted to ask you about, because Baltimore really has this vibrant immigrant community. It's a city rich with diversity, and it's known to have an immigrant friendly uh, ideology. I don't know. Is it officially a sanctuary city, or it is? Okay. Um, but one of the things that kind of struck me as awesome is that the city also has this Office of Immigrant Affairs that helps to integrate new immigrants into the community and help them to achieve economic success. Um, do you know much about that office, or have you ever had any involvement in it? And has it been successful?
Well, it's pretty new. I've been in previous mayors have had the a small like a person or two. This is the first time they've really drawn this office big. And yeah, I mean, ICE is the. I mean, the majority of immigrants in the state are closer to DC, where I am, but Baltimore does have this community, and ICE is located right downtown, and people report there, and the counties around. So it's um, they. But recently, and it was, I don't know if it made national news, but it was definitely on the news here. Is that the mayor was met with ICE because ICE was, he just said, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to jeopardize uh, our legal position, but also morally to just hold people until ICE comes to get them after they're in jail. I'm not going to be an arm of ICE, and so they met with him. Didn't really say what came out of the meeting, and I don't know, but Maryland's always been, Maryland has college. You have in-state college tuition if your parents pay taxes for 2 years before you graduate high school. And and this is the thing that certain places, I mean, we do have a few counties where under the program where the cops are basically ICE agents, and there's a few of those, but not statewide. And it's also a friendlier place in that sense. So, and that is one of the things in the that people that we see, and we're going to really start to see more of, is that people are going to move to certain states where and certain counties um, where they're welcome, where they can have economic assistance, where they can be, where immigration status doesn't isn't the main thing for a local government. Where
Yeah. And I've noticed that a lot of the larger cities are starting to lean into these immigrant affairs types of offices. Like Chicago has one, and while a lot of communities across this country are, openly rejecting immigration or immigrants, I see that as a potential major benefit for these cities economically, especially. You know,
well, I agree, but I also think that this is I think that this is where I think the hidden there's something hidden, and let me go into that a sec.
sure.
But when I was teaching, one of the projects I did, I taught a class, an upper level undergraduate class, so they weren't law students, called Immigration and Ethnicity, and I had them do two papers. Didn't like exams, got them out, but I had them do two papers, and one of them was something they chose and cleared, and the other one was a case study of different communities around the country. None of them were big cities except for Minneapolis, and I only wanted them to talk about the Somali community there, and I wanted them to do a beginnings of immigrants coming to how they dealt with it politically, what stresses it put on a system. And these were cities where mostly people went to do it work, like meat packing or carpet. There's a town in Georgia that was a big carpet sale town, and so you had this huge influx of people out of nowhere, which often would double the population. Something like Springfield,
Yeah.
which they're talking about now, and so they would do well. Actually, Dayton was one of them, which is next to Springfield, and Dayton, Ohio, was the example. One, is an inspiration for me. I met a guy from Dayton, Ohio, the other night, and he thought I was crazy. We were waiting in the line to see Carter. To see his
His
casket at the
casket. Yeah.
Capitol. Yeah, and so he thought I was crazy because I was like, "You come from heaven," because Dayton has a 33-page compact, which I talk about a lot, and it's amazing. It's an how to integrate what you were talking about, integrate the community. So it's to the police. These are the things that,
Hmm.
don't assume that people are going to respond a certain way to you, because we've had people that were shot by police because if somebody pulls a gun on you in a uniform in their country, that means you run because they're going to be killed or you're going to be detained and tortured. So they ran and they shot him in the back because they were, quote, resisting arrest, or these cultural things, and integrating them in, and setting up a series of programs to integrate them into the community. And so and we heard from the businesses in Springfield, hey, not these are better, not these are like, I mean, I don't like the narrative immigrants make. I think those are cheap talking point narratives that are annoying to people. Immigrants make us better and all the no, because they're there. Like, and I think in the South you see these evangelical churches, and you see people there, and you know what, you and I might think their ideology, we might not want them on our school board, put it that way, because they might be bad in books too. Like, people come from all different backgrounds as immigrants, and they may be they may they have all these, but they fit into the US. I mean, I remember a few years ago we were in northern Georgia, coming back from Atlanta to my aunt in South Carolina, and we were at a fireworks place, and there were two guys there, and they were buying up all these fireworks, and they had their and big trucks outside, and one was a Latino guy, and the other was a white local guy, and they each had their landscaping T-shirts on, and I said, they got more in common. I said, if you let those guys hang out, they're going to hang out a whole lot better than I am with them,
Yeah.
because the thing is, like, they that's why when people talk about like Latinos voted for Trump, it's like,
Yeah.
what, why are you yelling Latinos? Why don't you yell at everybody else? Like, they're Americans. you know my client doesn't want to take a vaccine. It's like, oh well, my neighbor didn't want to take a vaccine either. Welcome to the US. It's like, yeah.
But that's the
And
beauty of the United States in a way, is that you can be who you want to be. You know what I mean? Like, you don't have to fit a certain stereotype or mold, which,
That's
for
the
better or
that's the
worse.
hope. That's the hope. I think
Yeah.
that's the thing that you and I really like about it. That it's not. I mean, when I worked at the Organization of American States, something I did in between college and law school, directing their English department. It was when Bill Clinton was right after college, when Bill Clinton was running, and they didn't understand how you could elect a Bill Clinton when you had a pedigree. You had George H.W. Bush. His father was a senator. He was an ambassador. He was
Yeah.
because in their country it's class, and the Bushes are a class family, and Clinton was, and I said, no, in our country generally, we that is the hope. That's the thing that we hope happens. And so,
Mhm.
and that's why I think, like, the main thing to fight, and this is even among our colleagues, is that we don't view immigrants as cogs in some economic system, but as people in the US that get to screw up, that, obviously get punished for crimes, but don't get exaggerated, don't get pushed further. And we have, and that's why I don't like when people say, well, immigrants do things better and immigrants are better. It's like, no, they're not. They're the same as
They're
everybody else.
just
They have,
like you and me. But
yeah,
I
they came
think,
across they came across an ocean. They
yeah.
took a lot of risk. They did those things. Yes.
But what they do have, I would say, more so than maybe a second or third or fourth generation immigrant, is they have, I think, that extra drive to want to succeed, and then give their children that opportunity, which is what, we are the beneficiaries of.
Yeah. I mean, often that's true. At least they have the experience of having done something
Hmm.
intense. Now, we also know people who've brought their kids over here, and they're deadbeats, and they,
Yeah.
so it's like, yeah, but I think they do it. That is the thing, is they've done something intense. It's kind of like, you know, I think very few people we know like Jim Jordan, but my son thinks he's a god because he beat the top wrestler in like history of college wrestling, and he was the number one wrestler in Ohio. So he's kind of known for that. So it's like, okay, the guy, that takes a lot, so there's something where you admire something that somebody's done, but
Yeah.
you don't
I
know who
mean,
they
you
are.
could be a god in, athletics, and then
Yeah.
be Satan in every other
Right,
aspect of
right,
life.
right. but to do, but it's that drive, right?
Yeah,
It's the drive of like getting to power. It's the,
exactly.
drive to getting here,
So,
'cause we know, right?
do you get emotional um when like, do you get emotionally involved, or do you feel emotion when your clients have success or failure? And
Well,
I mean, like, I've
I,
sat in court and
mhm.
cried. I mean,
Oh, every time,
yeah.
every grant, I have to hold it back, or
Hmm.
every grant, because you're sitting next to somebody and you can feel the energy, right?
Yeah.
You can feel the energy, and the judge is reading this decision, and they start off and you don't know, and then there's a point where they're going to grant, but you don't know, because for those of
It's
us,
like a poker face.
yeah, for those of us who aren't us, the judges, and it's funny because I thought they were writing it. This is how like obtuse I was. I thought that each of them wrote that. Somebody who had worked at the court said, "No, no, it's like what is that? What are those games where you fill in the line? Mad Libs."
Mad Libs, yeah.
It was like Mad Libs where they have all this stuff and then they fill in the line.
Yep.
So it's like, yeah. So I thought, they're really amazing because they just took notes and they read this decision. But when they're reading it, they go through all the facts and then each person, so you don't know when. And that point when they would read it, where you knew it was granted, yeah, it's like because you could feel their release and you're sitting next to them, and it's, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it makes you a stronger advocate too, because you know, you are there, like your dad said, you are all they have.
Yeah.
And those are such important words to, I think, sometimes live by. It can also be a little bit dangerous as far as being a little too codependent with your clients. And then, I think from a mental health perspective, that can be difficult because,
I've gotten, over the years, I've gotten good at that because you just feel it. It's like,
mhm,
why when people say, "What do you mean you stop like wanting to think about something after?" I said, "I can't." I mean, we know there is the potential doing what we do to really spiral,
yeah,
because to really spiral. And my other mentor taught me something I'll always, keep in, is that, well, she said these aren't death penalty cases in a sense, but I had a client like that, and I was like, I mean, I fought tooth and nail. It was a city. It's going to go up to circuit court. I think it's but he said to me, look, I know you're fighting, and my brothers all got together, and they're buying me a house in Ghana in case I get deported, and Guyana. And I said,
mhm,
I'm thinking, this guy could end up it is living his last. He's living in the mid-50s. He could live the rest of his life in Guyana, in a home. His brothers are building him, and they can go down and see him, and it's beautiful. And that's the worst that's going to happen. So you know what? You're there with him, and people. He came here, and he may go back.
yeah,
And so yeah, and also just no, it is. I'm very good. I've become very good at that. And but it's also important that we, like you said, we have to have this extra skill in what we do, in alleviating the anxiety as best we can for people,
yeah,
and knowing that they can. And that doesn't mean, and that's what I'm saying, like, we've been around, and you know especially learning if you have kids or you're around kids, or you know that there's certain things you can't control and you can't manage, and you can't control if somebody's going to feel bad when they leave your office, because the immigration, sometimes we can tell them and explain, they'll be like, thank you, and they'll be like, I know you're with me, just please keep me updated, and they'll relax. And sometimes you could tell them and they'll just be like angry, call you the next day and say, why aren't you doing anything? And
exactly.
it's
Yeah,
like, and I think it's important for us to have the tough skin of saying, look, if you want that lawyer, then and then they will might say, but there are lawyers that will do that, and everyone has their own um, meter, but I know that that's hard.
what do you what do you do outside of work that helps you to, like, I mean, do you do anything outside of
Oh
work,
no,
like, to
none.
keep yourself grounded and
Oh,
to
I do
keep
too much.
yourself
I do
sane?
so much. I do so much that our colleagues are like, you never work. No,
So
because I enjoy what I do. Oh, I
what do
love
you like
going.
to do?
Oh, I like to hike, and I live right in Rock Creek Park, so
Mhm.
I hike a lot. I love to movies. I
Yeah.
love baseball. I go to a lot of Nationals games in the summer. A few Orioles. Love baseball. I pretty active with the Jewish Voices for Peace in the area. I'm
Sure.
kind of active with them. I was my side gig there was to sort of support the students that were arrested for their encampments and stuff and work with them. Anything stuff that I can do around younger people and different kinds, like I love that because it keeps me there. I've got a 19-year-old living with me, and we hang out, and then
Yeah.
I've got so I travel. I like traveling. I love to travel, and we have great weekend places too. And um, you know, uh,
Well, let me ask
music.
you, there's one question that I have to ask you, and that I
Oh.
love to ask any lawyer that I've spoken to, even not on this podcast, but in your career, was there one situation that stands out as the most ridiculous thing you ever had to deal with the government? Like, what was the most ridiculous thing the government ever did in a case that you're just like, I can't, just complete mind boggles the mind? And I'm not talking like, you file an application and it gets rejected. Was there anything that, or I mean, maybe kind of a trend of ridiculous stuff that you ever had to deal with?
Well, there's two categories. There's sort of the ridiculous error.
Hmm.
Like I told this one a few weeks ago. I mean, and there's so many. I don't think one stands out. But I did and everybody and people can know this because of the TV show. But I had somebody who did a fiance visa, and and everybody knows like your fiance comes and you have to marry in 90 days. Like all of our relatives that watch the show know that. So the immigration service sent a request for evidence saying you didn't give us the marriage certificate. I could tell like any of my cousins that one who know nothing about immigration law because they knew that because they saw the people deciding whether to get married or break. They could see that on whatever channel that was on. So that was yeah. So you get
TLC.
that ridiculous stuff, but the mean stuff, the mean, which we might see stuff, the things that are, I think, will shock the conscience of newer people
Hmm.
than us is when I first started out. I had a case, and it was a gay asylum case. And the applicant was from Guatemala, and his husband was or boyfriend. They didn't have legal marriage in D.C. at the time, I don't think, but it was the early 2000s. He was in Afghanistan working to support like the U.S. in Afghanistan. It was this time of year, so it was snowed in Afghanistan in the mountains. He worked on the base, and he was like a researcher of some sort, doctor, and he um, uh, was a witness on my witness list for the asylum office to testify. And I asked for a continuance until he got back in a month. And uh, I got a call on Friday, and it was on Tuesday, and they said, no, we're going to deny that. It was at 5 o'clock. We're going to deny that, and we're going to go ahead. And if we want it later, we'll ask for it. And I was shocked that somebody could be that mean. I went above them and it got changed. I mean, there are certain things that are just to the conscience sort of shocking,
Hmm.
like that. But
The
so there's been a
cruelty. I
few.
mean, the cruelty
So,
of people. It just it never ends. It's never ending. I had an email yesterday. This family is in Mexico. They're waiting on a waiver to get their one of the family members are waiting on a waiver to get back into the United States legally, and so that they can have their permanent status. But while that's happening, one of their closest relatives is on her deathbed in Phoenix, and they came to the border to try to get a parole, a humanitarian parole, to come in and see their dying relative. And CBP was not only super nasty about it, denied it. Um, it's like there are ways that they can guarantee the person will come in for a short period of time and return. They've got ankle monitors, they have ways to do that. but they don't want to do it because they're cruel.
Cruel, unimportant.
Hmm.
I mean, but it's also what the job is too. I mean, I remember during the Muslim ban, I was at the airport and I was with a colleague of ours, Hassan Ahmed, who wrote the
Oh yeah.
article with me. He and I wrote the article about the Muslim ban for the federal
Hmm.
bar, and he had a client, a 75-year-old man, who was in inspection for 3 hours before they let him go, and the CBP agent was 10 at night, and they were like they didn't know what to do, and they're not. I mean, that's the thing is that for the most part, and this is the problem. People, what happens is you empower the ones that or enable the ones that act a certain way, and most don't. I mean, our friend Todd Miller writes in his book about he's an amazing journalist up
Writer.
from the
Yeah.
border who's in Tucson. And for people out there, and Todd, wrote told the story when he was a keynote at one of our conferences about in his book about a CBP agent taking a child who was starving in the desert and dehydrated and cradling them and doing. I mean, people are people, and but what it does is it empower when don't when you have people act nice to other
Hmm.
people just to it functioning as human beings, even though the law is what it is, you do empower a level of cruelty which I don't think is out there. I don't
Yeah.
think most people. I mean, how many people do you know that that won't let somebody cut their grass if they're not, or won't associate with somebody, or
Because of
who
their
see
legal
somebody,
status or
yeah, or
not.
see
Yeah.
somebody next to them. And whenever I've debated people from FAIR or people these right wing immigration, I mean, groups. My contention is, it's anybody who's truly anti-immigrant. There is no argument other than racism.
Yeah.
Now,
Exactly.
because they're not talking about making a system work better, they're talking about working on stereotypes. And I say to them, look, you can walk around in your suit in DC and have your ideas and go on your shows, but I got a client who's a dude in Western Maryland, and he's got his business partner is a Salvadoran guy, and if you're going to tell him that this guy is has to go because of his immigration status when he's doing his business partner and he chose him, you're what does that mean for what does that say about you?
Yeah. Exactly.
And that's the thing, is what does that say about you? And and it's disturbing. You look at the history of a guy like Stephen Miller. I mean, he's a fascinating guy because he comes from the same background we do.
Exactly. And
And so,
it's a real, I think, examination of nature versus nurture a lot of times in those types of scenarios. Like, we come from very similar backgrounds, but end up with completely different ideologies.
well, yeah, but he was raised by he was raised by wealthy liberals in Santa
Liberals,
Monica.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but he had like the experience, and then you get this hatred, and you get somebody who gets to co-bully.
Hmm.
It's like the co-bullying
Yeah.
of the government. So people, the cream, right now, those folks can't act a certain way because there are people above them who might even be people of color or people of, that might be gay, and people above them. And now they're kind of clearing the way, uh, for, for the ability to act in with overt
Yeah.
discrimination.
All right. So I have maybe about 5 more minutes, but I wanted to first of all piggyback on what you said. I recommend anyone that wants to, read a really good book about our border, and any books written by Todd Miller, but Border Patrol Nation is a book that I would recommend. He also did a book called Storming the Wall, Empire of Borders, Build Bridges, Not Walls. Any book by Todd Miller, recommend, but Border Patrol Nation is very, I'd say, revealing.
And you can put in the show note, like you can put his Border Chronicles, which you can subscribe
Yeah,
to, which is the source,
yeah,
the source
yeah.
for the what's going on the border, which we learn about, and it's a different world. You as your listeners know, you live down there, you practice on the border, which is
Hmm.
way different. It's a different world.
It is. I mean, there's green and white vehicles all over, just sprinkling the landscape down there. And it's interesting when you go down into the border region and the borderlands, um, you don't see a lot of people right now. I mean, I was down there a couple months ago, and um, there was like no traffic at all. It was just mainly border patrol guys driving around, monitoring, and that's it. There wasn't, people going through the desert. So, I was going to get into the whole Lake and Riley Act, but we won't do that. I want to just ask you, you know, we've lived through the first Trump administration era, Trump 1.0. What, I mean, do you have any sort of, if you had a crystal ball in front of you, thoughts on what we're going to see over the next 4 years? And is there any hope?
I think there's going to be more. Maybe the cruel folks can rise to the top, and I think that's where community matters. I think communities matter. Last time I remember, like, my friends not in our world were asking, what can I do, what can I do? And it's like, you can volunteer. Find your age, find your local places, support the immigrant families, your local clinics, your local places where people are, support them. Come up with your, show that you as communities won't do that, and get your local. A lot of it's going to come, like, make to assure your local politicians, state and national, which is what, when I know we're not getting into Lake and Riley, but the message from that is that you've got to show that it's a myth that people voted, that people wanted harsh policies towards immigrants, and that's why they voted the way they did. Because politicians are reacting that way, and people need to show, no, this is what we want. And so I do think, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. There's the hysteria, and there's statements and policies, but like you said, the border, people aren't crossing the border. Why? Because it's hard. Immigration's not the only thing. I mean, immigration's hard or ain't easy, as somebody once said, but it's not. It's not just what we do; it's getting in. When we know people can't just. We're going to fortify the wall. Okay, well, you've already got infrared, and you've got like every level of technology supervising the border, that they can see anybody coming across. It's not like, you know, in that sense, there's a lot more to do enforcement wise. They could detain people. You might see that. You might see the detention and the meanness there. And I think people can, in communities where these detention centers are building, can, tell the news, go down there, go down to these remote parts of the US, because that's the biggest thing. Is that last time, it took a long time before they found these places where they detain immigrants. And they really are like, I had just a quick one. I had a case in Louisiana where somebody was detained, and I was going with my kids to New Orleans for 8 days in August in 2019. And I said, "Oh, I'll go visit him 5 hours away, 5 hours from anywhere.
Yeah,
Nobody's near these places."
I don't.
And so you got to have people go and and talk about that. And that's part of the way that people are invisible. And the more things are visible, and so maybe with social media, that's what happened with Israel. All that was happening before, but with social media, people see things. And so maybe, I mean, it was the recording in Brownsville that Jennifer Harbury, hero human rights lawyer, did, in where she just took and recorded
The
kids in
child,
detention.
yeah,
Yeah.
crying. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, people know what it really means, because we can't. I don't ever feel like I can be responsible for explaining to people, because then you get an argument like, no, that really can't be. And it's like, people, like, I know I need to do that. You need to viscerally see it. And I think independent media, like what you're doing, those who are doing, have cameras that are going there and getting these films out,
It's
it could,
exposing it.
yeah.
And I will make a pitch. I did an interview. It was, if you go back about 3 or 4 interviews ago, that actually, once I post yours, it'll probably be about like 6 or 7. But I interviewed Natalie Cadwallader and Andrew Fells, who both spoke about enforced disappearances. and the fact that our
Mm.
system, I highly recommend listening to them and reading about the research they do about how our system basically is structured to disappear people and put them in places like you were saying where they have no access to basically the outside world and oftentimes don't even have access to a phone, and have legal assistance. And it's pretty eye-opening if you look into that a little more. But yeah, I mean, I am really, I feel like we are, we're this small fraternity of lawyers that have to, lean on one another. And maybe we don't see eye to eye on every little thing, but I feel so fortunate to have somebody like you, just to know that you're there doing, the work you're doing for the immigrant community, um, and being a humanitarian. And so I really want to thank you for what you do, and thank you for, I just say, helping others.
Right back at you. And I have to say that the first time that I became, I knew you some, but this was back in 2010 when, in the lame duck sessions 15 years ago, and uh, then the Dream Act came up, and all these Democrats that had already been voted out of office with no political future, all of them, these ones on their way out the door, voted against it. And you went to John McCain, who was the original sponsors, with all these DACA students to his office
I was Santa
and
Claus
one
that
kid,
day.
you were Santa Claus, and I remember one of the kids was in a wheelchair,
Yeah.
and we're saying kids now. These guys are 40
Well,
guys.
by the
It's
way,
like
one of those kids, the one in the wheelchair, is still my client,
wow,
and he still
wow.
has
Well,
DACA.
wow. Well, and that's the thing. And I'm going to end on this one, but I
Sure.
think that it's not just a small fraternity of us. I think that there's a larger. I do not. God, we cannot believe that the United States is an inherently
That cruel.
a organization that endorses that, but it's a hard thing to fight against any more than like the majority of Germans weren't special. They weren't predisposed to be fascists, nor Italians. Like people aren't predisposed, but the strength and the force of it and the so we have to have the strength and the force of a different I think almost like a different community, and that doesn't mean them light. That's the mistake that's been made, and maybe it's a mistake that's been made because people are indifferent and don't care. Who knows? But we have to kind of ignore that and say in these communities, you have a meatpacking plant. Nobody wants to say people to live on the other side of town. People don't want to live segregated. They don't want to live and there are immigrants all over the country, not just in cities. And nobody wants shoot. If it weren't for immigrants, the evangelical church in the South would be dead. Because these next generations aren't there. There's so many folks coming in, and I think I think that's there still,
Yeah.
and I think it's a winning message. And I think the message of like being hateful and mean just comes across as being hateful and mean, and and that's my optimism. There's my optimism.
Well, we'll leave it on an optimistic note. Thank you, Mark. Mark Shmueli, based out of Maryland. His office is in Tacoma Park. And, again, just another wonderful advocate for immigrants and human rights. So thank you, Mark, for joining me.
And thanks for all you do, Mo.
And thank you to my daughter, Emma Goldman, who I will thank at the end of every single one of these interviews so that she will talk to me and be my friend. No, I'm just kidding. And again, the podcast is Immigration Ain't Easy. And I look forward to just, continuing to tell these stories and lifting up my colleagues and immigrants. And we'll leave on that note. So have a great rest of the weekend.